This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, standing in for Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, that's A-A-S-A. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association, one of the most significant animal studies organisations in the world. You can join for just $60 Australian if you're a waged academic, or for just $15 Australian if you're a student, unwaged or precariously waged. You can follow ASA on Twitter at AASA_animals, and you can find them on Facebook. Or you can take a look at their website for all sorts of up-to-date news of interest to the animal studies community, calls for papers, conferences, research funding and more. This episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a series of academic books focused on animal studies. At the time of recording, the series is accepting proposals. If you're working on an animal studies book, you should consider contacting the editors, and that's Fiona Probyn-Rapsey, Melissa Boyd and Yvette Watt, to explore whether the book might be a good fit for the Animal Publics series. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr. Bob Fischer. Bob is an Associate Professor of Philosophy at Texas State University and the co-director of the Society for the Study of Ethics in Animals, which was founded back in 1979. He's authored dozens of articles on animal ethics and was a co-editor of The Moral Complexities of Eating Meat, published in 2015, and is the editor of the Routledge Handbook of Animal Ethics, published in 2020. Today, we're going to be talking about his book, The Ethics of Eating Animals, Usually Bad, Sometimes Wrong, Often Permissible, which was published by Routledge in 2020. Welcome to the podcast, Bob.
Thanks so much for having me, Josh. It's great to be here.
So can you start by telling us what inspired you to write this book?
Sure. So the book has sort of a long history. I started writing about issues related to the ethics of animal product consumption, 8 or 9 years ago, and had sort of been interested in these puzzle cases. How do you think about things like roadkill and insects and veganism and all of these cases where the standard arguments for abstaining from consuming animal products seem to not quite apply. And I was also interested in this stuff pedagogically, so I started teaching about the ethics of eating animals in my ethics courses. And you want to know how to respond to every objection that students have, and some of the objections are more interesting than others, and you spend a bunch of time puzzling over them. And so I've just been tinkering with these thoughts for a while. And I think eventually what happened was just that I sort of had enough work that it occurred to me, this stuff fits together. There's a larger story to tell, even though I'm still very much pro-animal and, against consumption of animal products for the most part. I don't think I can defend that using the arguments that I used to use. I don't think that those do all the work that I thought they once did, and maybe it's time I tell that story. So I cobbled a bunch of past work together, a bunch of thoughts that I had written down and not published, and tried to figure out, well, how does it all hang together in one big piece? And so that was the book that ended up emerging. The original hope was not to write that book, really. The original hope was to write a book that showed why I had been wrong to have all these doubts, and that, hey, regardless of where you start, we're going to end up being able to show that it's morally wrong to consume animal products. But it didn't really go that way.
I do want to ask you a little bit about the tension between wanting to write a book defending veganism and then actually writing a book defending non-veganism. But first, let me ask kind of the big question. So I think lots of listeners are going to have a good idea of why we'd call eating animals, to quote your book's title, usually bad or sometimes wrong. But why do you think that non-vegan diets are often permissible?
So the basic idea of the book is, hey, let's just take all of these arguments that people usually run against eating animal products. And the idea is, hey, they fail in one of two ways. either they actually show that rather than being vegan, we should eat unusually, I call it. So that means, that we ought to actually be pulling, animal products out of the trash, or eating insects, or having backyard chickens and eating their eggs and other sorts of things, or that the arguments just don't show what they were supposed to in the first place, that they fail for one reason or another, typically because they're either depend on some assumption about us being able to accomplish things that I think individuals can't accomplish, or because they end up just being overly demanding, where they, if they work, then they show that just about everything that we do is morally wrong because of its role in an unjust system or various unjust systems. And those sorts of conclusions seem to me to be implausible, that the whole point was to show that there was something special about animal product consumption, not to show that like being a member of a capitalist society is wrong. I mean, that might be true, but it's not what most people were trying to show when they were criticizing eating meat or buying meat from the grocery store, things like that. So those are the two ways that the arguments go. And part of that's because, part of the first part about, well, why these weird diets? It's just because we often, just are wrong about the harm footprint of various actions. So we think that by abstaining from consuming this product, we do the thing that's best for animals, that causes the least amount of harm. And part of what the aim of the book is to show is that, oh, well, there are cases where that's just not true. So it actually works out for one of these two sorts of reasons to be often permissible to eat in non-vegan ways, either because, hey, if these arguments worked, they'd show that we were supposed to eat things that we aren't, we don't think we're supposed to eat, like the leftover trash or the dead animal by the side of the road. Those are just implausible conclusions. I think we should reject those options. Or the arguments fail for the kind of generalization reasons that I just mentioned. And either way, it seems like, well, I guess we end up with this sort of often permissible option. Of course, I still think it's bad, like it's, I don't do it myself. I don't really want you to do it, but can I show that with an argument that I find plausible? No, I can't show that.
I see. So I understand this thought about eating unusually, these kind of surprising animal products that are a little bit different to what people are normally buying from supermarkets, say. But could you say a little bit more about the expectation that people do too much, or what was the phrase you used? Expect us to be able to do things that we can't do as individuals.
Yeah, I mean, the thought is just like, hey, lots of people have this idea that, well, if you want to help animals, stop eating animal products, right? If you want to save the lives of animals, don't do this thing. That seems to rely on a background assumption, which is that when you stop eating animals, you save X number of animal lives or whatever. You reduce production levels by some specific amount. And this is sort of baked into lots of animal advocacy. If you sort of look around ordinary animal advocacy, you can save 281 lives by going vegan this year, right? That sort of thing. There's just a big problem with that, which is that it doesn't look like individuals have those kinds of impacts, that we're just mistaken about the efficacy of individual consumer choices. And there are a bunch of different reasons for that, but the basic one is that the ordinary grocery store is incentivized not to be sensitive to the behavior of individual consumers, even if they are extremely sensitive to the behaviors of sets of consumers. There's a lot of detail there, and you could read the book, but that's the sort of central problem on the causal side. Hey, you think you make this difference. It's not so clear that you do make this difference. And then on the overly demanding side, the thought is something like, and I don't think I say this as well as I could have in the book, so one more reason to go slower and write more carefully than I tend to. But I think that, the crucial idea is something to the effect of, when we set out to show that there was something wrong with consuming animal products in general, we are not trying to do that typically as part of some systematic critique of all consumption. There's no ethical consumption or capitalism or something like that, right? It's supposed to be that, hey, look, lots of what we do is fine, but this is different. This is especially objectionable. And if it turns out that the reasons we have for abstaining from consuming from animal products are exactly the same as the reasons we have for, not doing a whole range of things, like, buying gas guzzling vehicles, or not, buying fast fashion, or, avoiding non-fair trade chocolate or whatever. If it turns out that's the same sort of reason, well then, it might be bad to consume these things, all else equal, but it's not going to be the kind of distinctive wrong. And then there's going to be this question about the relationship between, this issue and all the others. And it's not obvious that animals should get prioritized in that calculation. There's a lot of argumentation that's being suppressed there, details, et cetera, et cetera. But the thought is just, we were supposed to be showing that this was special. If it turns out that it's just like everything else, and that all the things that we're doing are wrong because of we're taking part in an unjust system, or we're supporting practices that cause unnecessary harm, or what have you, well, we just do that all the time. And that seems to generate way too many obligations if we really say that every time you're supporting an unjust practice, you've got a decisive moral reason to stop consuming that thing.
So in this book, you've followed the argument where it took you. And I think this is often framed as a virtue in philosophical arguments. But do you think there might be a danger in following the argument where it takes you in this case? Or to put it another way, do you feel a tension between your academic philosophical commitments and, dare I say, your kind of personal activist commitments?
So it turns out that I wish that I had something more helpful to say about this as a general matter, but as a personal matter, yeah, I definitely feel a tension, and it's very clear in the book. The introduction and the conclusion. I make it very clear to my audience, I would really like you to not do this thing of eating animals. I discourage you from doing it. Here's, in fact, at the end of the book, a recipe for not consuming animal products. Here's sort of a multi-step plan for phasing out your animal product consumption. So I'm doing a little bit of animal advocacy, even as I am trying to reassess these arguments that have been offered against consuming animal products. But of course, the whole book is just me saying, yeah, I don't think we have these obligations, or at least I don't think we have them on the basis of the arguments that I came to think we had them based upon. And so there certainly is a personal tension there where I wanted things to work out a certain way, and they didn't. But, I guess there's a larger set of issues here. I actually am a bit uncomfortable even about doing the podcast, because the truth is that I wrote this book for my 12 other friends who do animal ethics as professional philosophers. And I'm writing it for them, and I want them to think about it and tell me where I'm wrong. And then we advance this conversation. And I don't really want this book to be sort of widely known by average people. I don't want it to be a prop in their sort of knee-jerk rejections of duties to animals. So, I think there is a tension in that in a bunch of ways, but, one of them is that I really think that part of what my job is as an academic is to be as sort of rigorous as possible when it comes to argumentation. That means, and the way you do that is by publishing things that you're going to share with other academics to get them to engage with it, because people don't engage with unpublished work. So, you have to do this to advance the dialogue, but then of course you kind of have to suppress it at the same time because you don't want it to be misused. And I don't have a great way around that. I'll be honest, it makes me much more sympathetic to non-open access journals, because I think that there's this important place for academic work that doesn't actually line up with your long-term, all things considered values, but you don't really want to be out there in the general public. Sometimes I don't really like this trend toward everything being open access, because I think, no, I'm writing this for those other 12 people who really understand what's at stake and what this should be used for, and not for a bunch of people who want to take this and use it as a way to just excuse bad behavior without really reflecting on the significance of what they're doing. So, it's messy. But as I said just a moment ago, at bottom, I think my responsibility is to be rigorous, and then I need to have integrity in the work that I do. And if I don't think the arguments show what I thought they did, and this is my field of inquiry, well, I should say so. And then other people, are free to tell me where I'm wrong, and hopefully we'll all figure out the right thing to say thereafter.
Yes. Well, exactly what makes you a little bit uncomfortable about doing this podcast is what I thought would make this such an interesting podcast. So have you experienced any kind of backlash to what you've argued from the vegan community or from other academics?
Well, I don't think I'm popular enough to have experienced much of a backlash. But I will say that, I've certainly had some conversations with vegan friends in the philosophical community and activist friends in the philosophical community and beyond who just think this is bizarre and don't really understand why you'd bother. And they think that, the plight of animals is so bad and things are so heavily stacked against them, we shouldn't even do this kind of work. But, the thing is, I just don't have a lot of sympathy for that, because smart people will figure out the problems with the arguments, and smart people will say it. And maybe better that somebody says it who is genuinely sympathetic and wants to try to advance the conversation in a way that's, ultimately sympathetic to animals. And maybe better that we do it in a way that is sensitive to what's at stake, and that communicates very clearly an awareness and an emotional connection to what's at stake. So I get the resistance, but I don't find myself thinking that it's ultimately decisive.
So we can turn, I think, to some of the steps that you take beyond this sort of impasse that you've identified. Towards the end of the book, you introduce this idea of activist ethics. Could you explain what you mean by that phrase and what relationship this idea has to veganism?
Sure. So, for me, part of the puzzle is that I still have this very strong sense of obligation, even though I don't think that ultimately I am responsible to do the things that I thought I was responsible to do for the reasons I thought I was responsible to do them. So then what do I do with that sense of obligation? Well, one account is just a debunking story. Hey, you thought that you were obligated to do one thing, you were wrong. Sorry. And so, yeah, that feeling might persist, but it's mistaken. But the other account, and the account I end up favoring, is one that says, well, we can take on identities. We can join political groups. We can have practical projects that give us obligations in virtue of the role that those identities or projects or political roles play in our lives. And I'm hardly the first to say things like this. It's an old idea. It's been developed in all sorts of rigorous ways by other people. I'm just, borrowing some very, very general ideas. But the thought is that, many of us have made animals our cause. We have become animal people, if you will. We are invested in knowing animals. And because of that, yeah, if it's usually bad, as I say in the book, to buy or to consume animal products, then that badness combined with our own personal reasons can actually generate obligations for us. In the same way that, once you've joined a particular political cause, you can be responsible to do things for the sake of that cause that the average person who hasn't joined the cause might not be. So I think that my view about a lot of activist obligations, that felt sense of duty, is that it's real. It's responding to some genuine normative feature that people really do feel and I think are bound by. But it's not to be explained by some general obligation that applies to just about, every reasonably healthy, person with a middle income or better. But rather it's that it combines the sort of weak general reasons that we all have to make various kinds of personal changes with a deeply held personal project that generates genuine obligations.
I see. And so do we have an obligation to become activists, to become animal people, in your words?
Yeah, right. So, I think this is exactly the right question to ask. The short answer is no, I don't think so. Basically, because all the arguments that you can run for being vegan and their problems, I think, are the same kinds of arguments and the same kinds of problems you would run for having to become a animal person. So I think that we can just push the whole conversation that we just had about veganism back to the ethics of being an animal person and basically get the same sorts of results. But that is a relatively undeveloped part of the book. That section goes by in a chapter. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe it turns out that we do have reasons to join groups that are distinct, or to take up causes that are distinct from the causes we have to make certain kinds of other practical changes. And if so, then then maybe we could sort of get veganism in through the back door that way. I'm not terribly optimistic about that, but I'm not wholly closed off to it either. And I would love to see someone write the paper that says, Bob thought we didn't have to do this, but we do by Bob's own lights. that would be a fun result for me. So, or a satisfying result. Fun is too, trivial of a word, but it would be a satisfying result if it were to work out that way.
So what's the bottom line here? Just let me ask directly, should we be vegans?
If you are asking me the question, do I think that there is a general moral obligation that applies to most people in developed countries, et cetera, to be vegan? The answer is, well, not based on the arguments that I've seen. I don't think we have that duty. If the question is, hey, are there very good reasons to do this? Would I like you to do it? Do I sometimes best express those very good reasons and my strong desire in terms of the language of shoulds and oughts? Then the answer is yes. But, when I'm playing the academic game and I'm thinking about what it takes to establish general moral obligations, I hold myself to this higher standard and use words like should and ought in this very precise way that's held to this high argumentative standard. And when I'm talking more colloquially and I'm, explaining to a friend why I think, hey, probably a good idea to change what you're doing. And yeah, you really should. I think that's a fine way of talking. It just isn't the same thing that I'm doing when I'm in the philosophy classroom, as it were.
Now, Bob, we ask everyone who comes on the show 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Shoot.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
It was that book by Singer and Mason, The Ethics of Eating Animals, and The Ethics of What We Eat. Sorry. No, it's not named after, I didn't directly steal the title. The Ethics of What We Eat, which was at a recommendation of a friend in graduate school. And, it was a really eye-opening and wonderful book. I still value that book considerably.
And can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes, it was a paper called Disgust in the Collection of Bovine Fetal Blood. It was all about whether the disgustingness of various aspects of intensive farming provides us with a reason to abstain from those products, for understanding the wrongness as well of those actions.
And where was that one published?
That was published in a book edited by Hadley and Altola called Animal Ethics and Philosophy.
And if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I suppose it would be Cora Diamond, even though she's not normally thought of as an animal ethics scholar or an animal studies scholar. She has a couple of famous papers, but that's not been the main focus of her career. But I think that her influence is primarily in her resistance to this sort of extraordinarily compelling line of argumentation that you get from folks like Singer. And even if she's wrong, and it's not that I think that she gets all the details right, it's more that she embodies this kind of willingness to say, I recognize that you are not going to take what I'm saying seriously, but there is a move to be made here, and it needs to get recognized that it's an option and that it's actually kind of an interesting option and it should be explored. And that intellectual integrity I like a lot, and has been, something I don't know that I've achieved, but I've tried to model myself to some degree after that willingness to say, oh, maybe there is some totally different angle that needs to get examined here.
Now, this is an interesting question given the conversation we've already had, but what do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that question. I'm genuinely unclear on what academics should be doing, but I will say just a couple of quick things. One is that I think many of us could probably do a better job of deciding what to focus on. There are a lot of people out there in the world who are trying to do important work for animals that we could be helping with as philosophers or as, animal people generally. And, but we don't necessarily pick our projects based on maximal impact. We pick them based on what we're interested in and what would be fun and what, our friends think is cool and so on and so forth. And that's okay. It's all right that we do that. I don't think it's, some grave moral failing, but I think it would be better if more of us actually partnered with, existing think tanks and activist organizations and said, what research do you need done to which I might be able to contribute? So I think one thing we can do is be better support for people who are on the ground, as it were, in the trenches, whatever the appropriate military metaphor is. But the other thing I think we can do that's important for animals is to be really honest and say, yeah, here's where we think the arguments are good. Here's where we think they aren't so good. Here's what we think, everyone really ought to accept. Here's where we think there's room for disagreement. To not come off as the kinds of people who can be dismissed because we have such a strong agenda and we're unwilling to sort of acknowledge the limits of what our arguments show. So I really value academics who show that kind of intellectual modesty, and I think it's a good thing when it is exhibited. So those are at least two things that academics can do.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Yeah, I love this question. It's a difficult one because, of course, you just want to follow up with about 75 different follow-up clarificatory questions. And the one question that, occurred to me as I was, not the question, but the one thought that occurred to me as I was mulling this one over was, well, what are all the other people going to wish for so that I don't need to wish for that because it's already been covered? But I will say that I guess, I'm not a very optimistic person. And I worry that any change that we make for animals is, it looks like a step forward, but it's in fact, in the long run, going to be 2 steps back. And so I really am interested in trying to think harder about how to make stable changes for animals. And so a lot of what I want to see change are just changes in the systems of incentives that structure what we do. And so if I could change one thing about the human non-human animal relationship, would be to look for ways to incentivize actions that are good for animals and disincentivize actions that are bad for them. And that could be as simple as changing, pricing structures and all other sorts of things. But I think just some modest changes, clean meat being available at 10 cents a pound, by which I mean, lab grown, in vitro meat products, not anything else. But, if that were available 10 cents a pound, that might be the single best thing that could happen for animals. It would be such a dramatic shift in the incentive in terms of, well, if you care about price, you will abstain from consuming genuine animal products because you'll eat this stuff instead. That's the sort of thing that I would love to see. I don't know how much we can change people, but we can change incentives. And if we could do that systematically in a few small ways, I think we'd see some pretty radical shifts.
What is it you're working on next?
The big project is a book about wildlife. So it's called Wildlife Ethics, and it's a book pitched to conservation biologists and veterinarians and wildlife managers and people involved in population management of all types. And we've got 4 other co-authors, and we're trying to put the idea of animals as individuals on the table in that context, and then help people think about the moral issues in those fields when animals are seen as being morally important directly in themselves and not just as representatives of species. And it's a very modest project in some ways. It's not the animal rights for the conservation community. It's an attempt to speak to those audiences where they are and to try to figure out how to sort of take some first steps in animal as individual focused directions. But the hope is that it will be a way of presenting something that pushes that conversation forward and that is sympathetic enough to the work that those folks are doing that those books could be used in classroom taught by an ethics of conservation course taught by a conservation biologist.
And how can people find out more about your work? And I'd like to add as well, how can people find out more about the Society for the Study of Ethics and Animals?
Sure, that's great. So we have a website, ethicsanimals.org, and it's got all sorts of useful animal resources and list of upcoming talks and The call for papers that we do for our annual workshop is there. We have a corresponding Facebook group, which has had lots of historically wonderful conversation, and it's a good resource for folks who are trying to just learn more about the new literature. I try to keep up on what's coming out and share a new article every day or two. So it's a way for people to stay abreast of the rapidly changing animal studies landscape. I, of course, have my own website, bobfischer.net, which is infrequently updated and no doubt rapidly going out of date because I have not given it the attention it deserves. However, the resources are there, and anyone, of course, is welcome to stop by.
Well, thanks so much for joining us for this chat, Bob.
And thanks so much for having me again. It's great to get a chance to talk about my work.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook, and you can find us just at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at @aveganphilosopher. Also, don't forget to tell others about the podcast and to review us on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.